Hi, everyone. I want to leave a comment today on the Israel conflict myself, in addition to all the posts I've been sharing lately, which didn't provide much commentary. And actually, my comment is not so much about the conflict itself, but about the logical mistakes I've seen people and media make when they interpret facts and build an opinion on what is right and wrong. Or, in other words, the human biases that are at work in this whole debate. And so I thought it would be interesting for some people to hear my perspective, and at minimum, it would help me structure my own thoughts. So, how do you know what is right or wrong, especially in an apparently super complex situation like this? And my perspective on this is you need to have an absolute standard and then check the facts against that standard. For those of you who are academics, it's really an application of the scientific method in everyday life. I'm just amazed again and again how little this is practiced. And so let me give you a couple of examples of what I see. The first one is not checking sources properly. Infos from sources with a track record of lying are not reliable. Hamas has a consistent track record of fake news, which you can check for yourself. But even some sources which you would expect to be dependable are unfortunately not. Sadly, the United Nations is the most famous one of them. It's a world organization with equal voting rights for all governments. And most of the world states are not democratic and sometimes outright totalitarian. So you can imagine that the votes of the UN General Assembly will typically not be super democratic and human rights friendly. It's quite logical, right? So what you get as a result is things such as Iran being appointed as chair of the Human Rights Council a couple of days ago, and no condemning of the Hamas attack. And these are just some examples. Just have a look at the resolutions of the UN in the recent years, and you get an idea of where they stand politically. So the UN is not an impartial body, and it biases against democracies and human rights very often. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the neutral reports coming out of the UN are often biased. And so going back to the case of Israel and Hamas, if you hear an Israel condemning statement of the UN, you should be mindful. Examples for this are UN Secretary General Guterres claiming that Palestine has been under Israeli occupation for 56 years, and the narrative of the local UN organization that Israeli attacked a refugee camp, which turns out to have been a refugee camp about 60 years ago, but not longer. And regarding that refugee camp, I did not question the news which spoke about that refugee camp at first, because why would I, right? I mean, if I start questioning everything, where does that lead me? But then I thought to myself, why is there a refugee camp in Gaza at all? Which refugees flee to Gaza? It's so weird, right? It's not like an attractive refugee destination. And then I Googled it and found out that the so-called refugee camp had been set up in the 40s to shelter Arab refugees from Israel and used until the 60s, and since then functioned mainly as a residential area. This difference matters because it creates this impression of the most innocent of the innocent being attacked by vicious airstrikes, and the UN supports this narrative. Number two, seeking the truth in the middle of two positions rather than based on an absolute standard. For example, let's suppose the German government and the government of North Korea, or any other government with questionable values and tactics, issues press release on the same topic. Would you also say that the truth lies somewhere in the middle? So why would you assume that the truth on the Palestine-Israel conflict lies somewhere in the middle between what the terrorist organization Hamas and the government of the Democratic State of Israel say? I don't get it. The third point, applying different standards. It's a little bit related to my earlier point. Have you noticed that Israel and Hamas and Palestine more broadly are often measured with double standards, even before this war? And my impression is that even in the current extreme case of the slaughter and the following Israeli attacks, where it should be obvious that these are very different things, these two acts are somehow compared very often. So on the one hand, you have more than 1,400 civilians killed, tortured, and raped on purpose and in the most creatively violent ways a human could ever think about, from mutilations to gang rapes, leaving hips broken, to babies baked in the oven, embryos being removed from the alive mother's womb, and so forth. On the other hand, you have civilians who have been warned of the attack up front, dying in an attack targeted at military structures. How can you seriously compare these two cases? Number 4, giving more importance to emotional individual anecdotes versus unemotional anecdotes and facts. People are emotional beings, obviously, and one of the unfortunate results, in my opinion, is that in my experience at least, it's very easy to manipulate someone to exposing him to emotionally appealing anecdotes. And most people will ignore reliable and statistically relevant facts if you're just able to show them a few human touch stories. In line with this, media and social media posts often focus on individual stories with the goal to evoke empathy, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as it serves as an illustration and not as a proof point. But it is often shown, and I think also interpreted as data, in such a way that a single crying and screaming woman mourning her dead son in front of the camera might be more powerful than a figure of hundreds of dead people. And similarly, a woman talking in a composed manner, or a man for that matter, no offense, in a composed manner about the loss of her family will probably be interpreted as a person requiring less emotional attention. In other words, there's a bias for individual stories of suffering, and I've seen this being used a lot in media reports. And I'm pretty sure that it's creating a skewed impression of the actual situation. 5th, believing that people are either victims or perpetrators, but cannot be both at the same time. In the case of Gaza, Hamas was elected by 44% of its residents in 2006, followed, by the way, by 41% Fatah, not exactly Democratic Party either, but that's a different story. A couple of years ago, 45% said they would vote again. They would vote Hamas again. And this is just a feedback on Hamas administration, not an agreement on their values, which I suspect to be much higher. And the reason I'm suspecting this is that I think it's a good indicator how Palestinians in a free speech environment position themselves. Have you seen any anti-Hamas demonstrations or noteworthy statements by anyone in the Palestinian international community? I checked Google and consulted with my AI search plugin Perplexity, which is awesome, by the way, and could not find anything. This is also in line with the celebrations and supportive statements of the slaughter we've seen in media by Palestinians. This does not look like most people in Palestine are actually critical of Hamas and are looking for a peaceful solution, let alone a liberation from Hamas, to be honest. It reminds me a bit of Nazi Germany. I'm pretty sure it's a myth that the Germans were secretly all against Hitler and were then happy to be liberated from their oppressors. And I get that this is controversial. This is just my hypothesis, obviously. I'm not a historian. Nazis enjoyed a lot of support among the Germans, in my opinion. And that is also why denazification was needed after the end of the Second World War, with key institutional figures replaced and communication campaigns for the general public. And the underlying love, by the way, of Germans for ideologies is still there, but that's a different topic. So they've really, what I'm trying to say, they've really tried hard, but I'm not sure they've 100% succeeded, even in Germany. My point is, you cannot maintain a totalitarian state without a fertile soil among the population. Nobody likes this, and it makes the entire situation more complex, but I'm afraid that this is simply how it is. Point number 6, justifying any actions with trauma or an assumed victimhood does not lead anywhere. Let's assume that Palestinians are in fact all victims of decades of oppression and abuse of Israelis. How could this serve as a justification for any of their direct or supported actions? This is a bit like saying, oh, we can't lock this mass murderer away because he had a bad childhood. Again, this is not a good moral standard. And if you apply it, at least apply it consistently. Do you think it's great to come from a people that has been persecuted and oppressed for thousands of years and not 70? What does that do to you? But again, I don't think this reasoning leads us anywhere, and we shouldn't be using it as an argument. 7th, complaining without a serious, better solution. People love it. The only valid judgment, in my opinion, is the one that takes the perspective of a decision maker and focuses on action. Rather than complaining with no concrete alternative solution, the question I think should always be, what would I do? And think your ideas through as much as you can. with your experience and your cognitive abilities, let's say. People often then say, I don't know, I'm not a politician, it's not my job, which is fair. But I find that often this is just intellectual laziness, to be honest, and not very helpful. At the minimum, people who don't have concrete, better ideas that have actually been thought through, shouldn't go around with very strong opinions, I think. In an ideal world, by the way, I think everyone should be able to think and say what they want, but simply suffer the consequences of their own actions to force people to take realistic positions. I think that would help the world a lot. Unfortunately, it's logistically not always possible. I'm just saying that it's easy to develop romantic ideas around an ideology and be pacifist as long as you're in a secure environment and don't actually deal with the implications in your day to day life. Point number 8, and this is my last point, following moral dogmas rather than finding the best solution according to fixed standards. For example, dogmas such as war is always evil or is never a solution are not helpful as standards to decide on the right course of action, in my opinion. There are situations where war is necessary because all other means have failed and other options are worse. It's not just the wrong moral standard, but also dishonest, I think. Only people in countries that feel safe have the luxury of saying this. So, and if you turn this around, put yourself in the shoes of a German such as me, if Putin stormed into Germany tomorrow to annex Germany into his kingdom, would you not fight back and instead try to have a diplomatic chat with him and refuse all military actions? Do you think that's going to work? Seriously? I do, however, believe in fixed standards. Though, as I said before, what is the difference? Fixed standards are, I think, I haven't thought this through fully, a desired outcome which cannot be broken down further rather than a means. For example, I think a valid perspective on peace would be that you want to maximize the time in which a majority of the population lives unharmed. This is not the same as never having war. So, in summary, what have I tried to say with all this? I think it's easy to get lost in complexity if you don't have a clear value set and framework of how you think about it. But I think it's important you develop that because, not you, but people in general, maybe you, that you develop that because else you are like a leaf in the wind and extremely easy to manipulate. We see this right now with big groups of educated people in Western countries who honestly feel they're doing the right thing. They're on the right side of history, supporting the oppressed, but de facto support an agenda that is against human rights and really against human civilization. And most of them won't even notice because they have this floating moral standard. They don't see it. So these were my 2 cents, or rather 8 cents, which I wanted to share. Let me know what you think. I'd be interested in your views on this, especially on the more controversial points I made. Till then, see you later.